Las Vegas, May 15th, 1989. A 5 o'clock newscast. Ordinary studio light. Ordinary anchor desk. Ordinary Tuesday evening. Then a man sits down, and you cannot see his face. The screen reads Dennis. Except Dennis is not his name. Dennis is the name of his boss at a facility that officially does not exist. In the next 11 minutes, this man will describe 9 craft stored inside a mountain in the Nevada desert, a fuel element unknown to any laboratory on Earth, and a propulsion system that should be physically impossible. He has no verifiable degrees, no traceable employment record, no government file, and 37 years later, the broadcast still hasn't been fully explained. Before that Tuesday evening, the official position on Area 51 was uncomplicated. The restricted airspace north of Las Vegas existed to test classified conventional aircraft. The U-2 spy plane had been developed there. The SR-71 Blackbird, various stealth programs whose existence was eventually acknowledged only after their operational lives had ended. The government neither confirmed nor denied the base existed at all. The facility had literally been removed from official maps, but the working understanding in the national security press and in the scientific community was that whatever happened inside that perimeter was extraordinary only in the human engineering sense. The secrecy was real, the programs were real, but they were ours, made here, by people with clearances and contractors and spreadsheets. The idea that the United States government might be in possession of craft from somewhere else entirely was not, in 1989, a position anyone with a career to protect was willing to take seriously. It belonged to a specific kind of magazine rack, to late-night AM radio, to people who would be very difficult to cite in a serious news broadcast without context. George Knapp knew this as well as anyone. Knapp was not a fringe journalist. By 1989, he had spent years at Class TV Channel 8 in Las Vegas, building a reputation that extended well beyond local television. He had won Edward R. Murrow Awards. He would later receive Peabody Awards. He was an investigative reporter in the serious, old-fashioned sense, someone who understood the difference between what a source said and what a source could prove, someone who had learned through practice that the most dangerous stories were the ones that sounded completely reasonable right up to the moment they destroyed your credibility. He was not looking for this story. The story arrived through a canceled interview and a phone call made under pressure. The original guest for the 5 o'clock segment pulled out at the last minute on the afternoon of May 15th. Knapp, needing to fill the slot immediately, called John Lear, a contact he used occasionally for aviation commentary. Lear was a former CIA contractor pilot and the son of Bill Lear, founder of the Learjet Company. He had real credentials in aerospace. He also had a habit of making claims about government knowledge of extraterrestrial craft that went considerably further than his verifiable aviation background could support. Knapp found him useful as a source in the specific way that serious journalists find useful people who exist at the edge of credibility, carefully, and with distance. But Lear had been telling Knapp, for some time, that he knew someone who hadn't just heard things, someone who had been inside. Could they get him to the studio? They could. And so a man Knapp had never met arrived at Channel 8 and sat down under studio lights with his face digitally obscured, his voice unaltered, and a false name on the Chiron. The name on the screen was Dennis. The man's name was Bob Lazar, and the reason the pseudonym was Dennis, as Lazar later confirmed, was that Dennis was the actual name of his supervisor at S4. Not a chosen alias, not a cover name invented for the broadcast. The name of a real person in a real chain of command that, according to Lazar, ran directly to the United States Navy. That detail is worth holding on to. A person constructing a false story typically selects a pseudonym with no connection to the fabricated environment, because any connection creates a thread that can be pulled. Lazar used the name of his actual boss. Either that was an extraordinary mistake from a sophisticated liar, or it was the kind of small involuntary truth that escapes a person when they are recalling an actual experience. Knapp noticed things like that. He spent nearly 8 months after the May interview investigating Lazar's background and the broader claims before putting the full story on air. That November, as part of a special broadcast titled UFOs, The Best Evidence, Class TV identified Lazar by name and showed his face. The broadcast became the highest-rated local news program in the station's history. Within days, it had been picked up in Europe and Japan. Robert Scott Lazar, Bob Lazar, was now attached, publicly and permanently, to one of the most specific and technically detailed claims about government possession of non-human technology that had ever been made on television. What the investigation found about his background was, depending on how you read it, either the beginning of a clear debunking or the beginning of something considerably stranger. Lazar claimed to hold master's degrees in physics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and in electronics from the California Institute of Technology. MIT had no record of him. Caltech had no record of him. This was not a matter of incomplete archives or bureaucratic error. Both institutions searched and found nothing. No enrollment, no transcripts, no degree conferral, no tuition payments, nothing. Stanton Friedman, a nuclear physicist who was also one of the most rigorous UFO researchers in the country, and who had every professional reason to want Lazar's credentials to be genuine, investigated the academic claims personally. He traced Lazar's actual educational history to Pierce Junior College in Los Angeles, a community college. The enrollment dates at Pierce overlapped precisely with the period during which Lazar said he was at MIT, 2,500 miles away on the other side of the country. One professor, Lazar, specifically named as a Caltech instructor, a man named William Duxler, turned out to teach at Pierce, not Caltech. Friedman's conclusion was unambiguous. The degree claims from MIT and Caltech were false. Not unverifiable. False. And yet the story did not end there. It rarely does. When Knapp contacted Los Alamos National Laboratory, where Lazar claimed to have worked as a physicist before being hired for S4, the lab told him there was no record of Robert Lazar ever working there. No employment file, no contractor record, nothing. Knapp pushed back. The lab held its position. Then Knapp found the 1982 internal Los Alamos National Laboratory phone directory. It was the kind of document that circulates inside a large institution and is not meant for outside eyes, but which eventually finds its way into archives and researcher collections. The directory listed the laboratory's scientists and technicians, among them Lazar Robert, not a reference to an outside contractor, a listing in the internal staff directory. Knapp also found a copy of the Los Alamos Monitor, the local newspaper serving the laboratory community, dated June 1982. The front page carried a feature story about a man named Bob Lazar and his passion for jet-powered cars. The article described him as a matter of straightforward identification as a physicist at the Los Alamos Meson Physics Facility. Not a technician, not a security contractor, a physicist. The newspaper had published it, identified him that way, and no one had issued a correction. When Knapp returned to Los Alamos with these two pieces of documentation, the phone directory and the newspaper, the laboratory did not revise its position. An official, described by Knapp as exasperated, told him there was still no record of Lazar. Later investigators and journalists would offer a more qualified version of the Los Alamos connection. Lazar may have worked at the facility in some capacity, perhaps as a technician or through a subcontractor arrangement, rather than as a directly employed physicist. That distinction matters for evaluating his credentials. It does not explain why the institution, when first contacted, denied he had ever been there at all, only to be confronted with its own internal directory. The pattern that emerged from these inquiries had a specific shape. When investigators contacted institutions that should have records of Lazar, they found either nothing or an initial denial, followed by a grudging partial acknowledgement. The credential claims, the MIT and Caltech degrees, appear to be false. The physical presence at Los Alamos appears to be at least partially real. Everything in between is unclear, and the government's response across all of these inquiries was not to produce a definitive refutation, but to produce silence, denial, or the minimum possible acknowledgement. If you were trying to discredit a witness, this is a workable strategy. You remove the most verifiable documentation. You leave just enough residual trace that the denial cannot be perfectly clean. You force anyone who investigates to spend their time arguing about the man's credibility rather than the substance of what he claims to have seen. The credential problem becomes the story. The story underneath it recedes. Knapp noticed this too. He spent years unable to fully explain it. But one thing he kept returning to: if Lazar had fabricated the entire story, the government's most effective response would have been simple. Produce a clear file. Show he was never near any of it. Let the documentation do the work. That is how you end a false story told by a nobody. You produce the record. You do not produce nothing. They produced nothing. And the question that Knapp, and eventually much of the world, could not stop asking was whether that nothing meant what it seemed to mean, or meant something considerably more deliberate. The phone book said he was real. The newspaper said he was there. The degrees were false. The government denied everything, until it couldn't, and then denied the rest. That gap between what was confirmed and what was claimed became the shape of everything that followed. It has not closed. The Nevada desert does not hide things the way forests do. There are no leaves, no canopy, no soft floor of accumulated organic matter to swallow what falls into it. The Mojave and the Great Basin are places of radical exposure, hard alkali flats, fractured ridgelines, the kind of terrain where a footprint left in the wrong kind of soil can last for years, where a road used once in 1960 can still be traced from the air in 2024. If you wanted to build something large out here and hide it completely, you would be working against the fundamental character of the landscape. The desert remembers, which is part of what makes the specific location Bob Lazar described so difficult to settle cleanly. Papoose Dry Lake lies approximately 15 miles south-southwest of the main Groom Lake complex, the installation most people know as Area 51. It sits inside a ring of low ridgelines in Lincoln County, Nevada, within the outer boundaries of the Nellis Air Force Range. The lake itself is a flat white expanse of dried alkali, roughly 1.5 miles across, the kind of surface that shimmers in summer heat and cracks into geometric plates in winter. From the air, it looks like nothing. From the ground, it looks like less than nothing. There are no roads leading to it that appear on any public map. There are no structures visible on its shore. A small group of Greenpeace activists walked directly across Papoose Lake in 1983, crossing the dry lake bed as part of a protest against nuclear testing in the area, and reported seeing nothing unusual. No security response, no fence line, no visible installation of any kind. Just silence and white ground and a ridgeline that looked like every other ridgeline in the Nevada test range. This is the landscape Bob Lazar described as containing, built into the hillside along its eastern edge, 9 aircraft hangars disguised to look like the desert slope itself. The description he gave was precise in a way that became more specific, not less, across decades of retelling. The hangar doors were corrugated panels painted and textured to match the angle and color of the surrounding terrain. From outside, they were not recognizable as doors. No visible hinges, no seam lines obvious from a distance, no external hardware. The facility sat below and inside the ridge rather than on top of it, the ceiling geometry sloping inward to follow the natural angle of the hillside. The interior walls were painted orange. The lighting came from strips mounted at angles following that same slope. The space had the feel of something utilitarian, a working installation, not a showcase. And in the hangars themselves, on low platforms, sat the craft. He arrived, as far as he could tell, at the base of a hill. A door opened in the hillside. He went inside. Getting to Papoose Lake without authorization is not possible. The surrounding territory is restricted airspace and restricted ground, part of the Nellis complex covering millions of acres of southern Nevada. Enforced with a seriousness that has occasionally involved armed response to trespassers. You cannot drive there and verify the ridgeline. You cannot fly over it at low altitude. The restricted zone ensures that any physical check of Lazar's description requires either classified access or satellite imagery, and the satellite imagery itself became its own complication in the months following his first interview. Analysis cited in the 2026 documentary S4, The Bob Lazar Story, and examined by OAP researchers reviewing the timeline afterward, suggests that commercial aerial imagery of the Papoose Lake area was subject to filtering or modification beginning in the same calendar month that Lazar went public, May 1989. Not months later, not years later, the same month. Vehicle track marks reportedly visible in earlier imagery in approximately the area Lazar described were absent in later filtered versions of the same coverage. This claim has not been independently confirmed through rigorous open-source satellite analysis by neutral parties. It should be treated with real caution. But it also has not been definitively refuted, and the timing, if accurate, carries an uncomfortable implication. Someone with sufficient authority to alter commercial satellite coverage of one of the most restricted locations in the United States was apparently paying close attention to what a man was saying on a local Las Vegas news broadcast. When you look at Papoose Lake on Google Earth today, you see a featureless landscape. No construction scars, no access roads, no fence lines, no evidence of large-scale earth moving. Skeptics have pointed to this repeatedly as straightforward evidence that no facility of the scale Lazar described ever existed there. A 9-hangar installation, large enough to house multiple disc-shaped craft, would have required substantial excavation. The removed material has to go somewhere. Regular bus traffic from Groom Lake would leave soil disturbance visible from above. Researchers conducting critical analysis of the S4 claim have compared the described footprint to the actual landscape and found no correspondence. The counterargument from supporters is not that the satellite images show evidence of the facility, but that underground construction and hard rock does not necessarily produce the same surface signatures as above-ground development. An installation built into a mountainside and subsequently sealed would, over decades, begin to resemble the surrounding terrain. Camouflage systems at a facility operating inside the Nellis Range would be more sophisticated than what commercial imaging resolves. This is genuinely ambiguous territory. The Nevada test site contains underground structures whose surface indicators were invisible from above for years. What the landscape cannot resolve, what no satellite image can address, is the specific claim Lazar made about the program's institutional identity. He said, clearly and consistently from his first anonymous appearance onward, that S4 was not run by the Air Force. It was run by the United States Navy. The program's chain of command ran through the Office of Naval Intelligence. The employer listed on the W-2 form Lazar produced was the Department of Naval Intelligence. In 1989, this made no institutional sense. The Nevada test site, Groom Lake, the classified aircraft testing environment that defense observers understood to exist there, all of it lived inside Air Force territory. The Navy had no obvious operational rationale for running a classified program in a landlocked desert installation 15 miles from an Air Force base. The claim seemed like the kind of error a person who didn't actually know the programs would make, getting the institutional geography wrong because they were guessing or inventing rather than recalling. Then, in December 2017, the New York Times published a story about a classified Pentagon program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. ATIP had been studying unidentified aerial phenomena since at least 2007, operating secretly with a budget allocated without public disclosure. It had collected sensor data, video footage, and pilot testimony about objects exhibiting flight characteristics no known human aircraft could match. And when investigators traced ATIP's institutional home within the Pentagon bureaucracy, it was housed under the Office of Naval Intelligence. The exact organization Bob Lazar identified as his employer in 1989 had been secretly running the Pentagon's classified UAP analysis infrastructure for years. That does not prove Lazar worked there, and it does not confirm the craft he described, but it means that the institutional detail, which looked most like a fabricator's mistake in 1989. The Navy, in the Nevada desert, operating a program inside an Air Force installation, turned out to describe, with unexpected precision, where the classified UAP programs actually lived inside the American defense establishment. The Janet Airlines connection adds another layer that is less ambiguous. Lazar described his transit to Groom Lake as occurring through a classified charter operation. A fleet of unmarked aircraft that transported workers from a terminal area near McCarran Airport in Las Vegas to the restricted base. This was not a detail he invented. The fleet of unmarked aircraft operated under contract and sometimes called Janet, a name whose origin is debated but whose existence is not, transported classified workers to Groom Lake and was photographed by aviation enthusiasts, documented by reporters, and eventually acknowledged by the government. Lazar described the mechanism correctly. You could argue he had access to this information through other channels. It was known in certain aerospace circles, but it represents another operational detail about the classified logistics of the program that checked out. 9 hangars. 9 craft. The program controlled by the Navy. Workers shuttled in on unmarked aircraft from Las Vegas. Hangar doors indistinguishable from hillside. The whole installation invisible to a group of protesters who walked directly across the adjacent lakebed 6 years before Lazar described it. None of it has been confirmed. None of it has been cleanly refuted. The desert holds its position. But Lazar was taken to only one of the 9 hangars. The program, as he understood it, was strictly compartmentalized. Each worker knew only what their specific assignment required, and his assignment was the propulsion system of one particular craft. The one he came to call the sport model. Not because of its appearance, though its lines were clean in a way that suggested speed, but because that informal name had circulated among the small team working on it. What he found inside that craft, the specific, awkward, uncomfortable physical details of a space designed for something that was not an adult human being, were the details that proved most resistant to simple dismissal. The hangar was real, or it wasn't. The craft was real, or it wasn't. But the way Lazar described the interior of what he found, the things that were wrong about it, rather than impressive about it, was the part that investigators kept returning to, years later, when they pulled out the old transcripts and tried again to decide what they were looking at. The hangar was not what Lazar had expected. That detail alone is worth noting, because people who fabricate extraordinary experiences tend to make them extraordinary in the expected directions, larger, more dramatic, more cinematic than anything you have seen before. What Lazar described when he talked about walking into the hangar that housed the craft he would spend months trying to understand was something closer to the opposite. The space was smaller than he anticipated. The lighting was harsher and less flattering than you would imagine for the most significant object in the history of the human species. The craft itself, sitting on a low platform, maybe a foot off the hangar floor, was about 15 feet tall at its highest point, and perhaps 52 feet in diameter. Not enormous. Not the vast saucer of science fiction, something that, in his words, looked manageable. He called it the sport model. The name came from the team, an informal designation. The way mechanics nicknamed the car they had been assigned to figure out. It was disc-shaped, which matched the popular image. But almost everything else about it diverged from what popular culture would have suggested to a person building a convincing false story in 1989. The exterior surface was what Lazar kept coming back to when he described it in interviews across 37 years. It had no seams. Not reduced seams. Not well-concealed seams. No seams. The hull appeared to be a single continuous material, uninterrupted across its entire surface. No welds, no fasteners, no panel lines, no external hardware of any kind. The color and texture he compared to liquid titanium, though he was careful to say that the material did not behave like any titanium or titanium alloy he had encountered. It was not reflective in the normal sense. It had a quality of surface that he struggled to describe accurately because the closest references in human materials science didn't quite reach it. If you stand in a conventional aircraft hangar and look at the surface of almost any aircraft, you see evidence of construction. Rivets, panel joints, access hatches, antenna mounts, fuel ports, the physical record of how the object was assembled. You can read the engineering history of a plane from its skin. The sport model, as Lazar described it, offered none of that. Whatever information its surface might have communicated about how it was made was not there to be read. He was allowed to enter through an opening in the lower portion of the craft. The opening did not have a door in any conventional sense. He went inside. The interior was cramped in a way that surprised him. The central space was dominated by a reactor, a device approximately the size of a basketball, positioned at what would functionally be the center of the craft's lower section. Around the reactor, the space organized itself along 3 levels or terraced areas, each lower than the central platform. The design logic, if there was one, was not immediately apparent to someone trained in human aerospace engineering. There was no cockpit in the sense of a forward-facing station with controls and instruments. There was no instrument panel. There were no displays. There were no visible control surfaces of any kind. There were seats, 3 of them, arranged around the reactor at the lower level of the interior. And this is the detail that Lazar mentioned consistently across decades, without emphasis, without dramatization, as though it were simply an uncomfortable fact he had noted and filed. The seats were too small for an adult human being. He could not sit in them. The proportions were wrong, not slightly wrong, not a matter of ergonomic preference, but wrong in the way that furniture built for a different body size is wrong. He described trying to lower himself into one of them and finding that the geometry of the seat did not accommodate his frame. He never made much of this in his interviews. He stated it and moved on, the way you state a practical inconvenience when describing a work environment, which is part of what made it stick with the investigators who kept returning to the transcripts. A person building a compelling false story about alien technology tends to lean into the dramatic implications of everything they describe. Seats too small for human occupants is an extraordinarily dramatic implication. It means the craft was built for something else, and Lazar consistently understated it. He mentioned it the way you might mention that the office chair was the wrong height. Matter of fact. Slightly inconvenient. Filed under observations I cannot fully explain. The lighting inside the craft behaved unusually. Lazar described halogen lamps positioned inside the craft's interior. He understood these to have been placed by the research team, not to be original equipment, and noted that they illuminated the surfaces they were aimed at directly, but failed to fill the interior with ambient light the way the same lamps would in a comparably sized human-made space. The light went where it was pointed. The surrounding interior remained darker than it should have been. This is not how light behaves in a normal enclosed space, where reflection and scatter from walls, ceiling, and floor gradually fill the volume with diffuse illumination. Inside the sport model, that diffusion was absent or dramatically reduced. This detail surfaced in an unexpected way in 2026, when director Luigi Venditelli and his production team were building a recreation of the S4 craft interior for the documentary S4, the Bob Lazar story. They reconstructed the space to the dimensions Lazar had described and placed halogen lighting inside it as he had specified. They encountered, during the build, the exact phenomenon he had described: direct illumination of targeted surfaces, with the surrounding interior remaining inexplicably darker than their experience with normal enclosed spaces had led them to expect. Venditelli described this as one of the details that most unsettled him during production, precisely because it was not the kind of flourish a person inventing an impressive spacecraft would think to include. It was too specific, too inconvenient, and too easy to accidentally disprove if it weren't accurate. You cannot go into a room, try to recreate someone's described lighting conditions, and find that the physics behaves unexpectedly, without pausing. The reactor itself Lazar described in terms that departed from conventional nuclear engineering. It was small, basketball-sized as he consistently said, and it functioned as he understood it, not as a heat source in the conventional sense, but as a gravity wave amplifier. The fuel was introduced to the reactor. A reaction occurred, and what emerged was not heat converted to mechanical energy in the way a combustion or fission system works. What emerged, according to Lazar's account, was a gravity wave, a distortion of the local gravitational field that could be directed and amplified to produce the craft's movement. The craft did not push against air or expel reaction mass. It fell, in a controlled sense, toward wherever the gravity wave was aimed. It bent space rather than moving through it. This propulsion concept, in 1989, had no precedent in public aerospace science. Anti-gravity propulsion was a theoretical area that serious physicists treated with varying degrees of interest and skepticism, but no functional system along the lines Lazar described had ever been built or demonstrated. The mechanism he described, using a heavy element as a fuel for a gravity wave generator, was sophisticated enough that nuclear physicists who examined his description found it neither obviously impossible nor obviously derivable from publicly available science as of 1989. It existed in a zone of specific technical plausibility that was uncomfortable to assign to pure invention. The fuel for that reactor was where the story moved into territory that would, years later, produce one of its strangest chapters. The element, Lazar said, had an atomic number of 115. That meant it sat on the periodic table between elements 114 and 116. In 1989, no element with that atomic number had ever been synthesized in any laboratory. The periodic table's known heavy elements stopped well below that point in terms of stable or even metastable forms. Element 115 was, in the language of nuclear physics, a predicted element. Its existence was consistent with the mathematical structure of the periodic table, but no one had yet managed to assemble one in a collider. Lazar said the element was stable. He said it produced, when bombarded with protons, a specific decay chain. Element 115 became element 116, which immediately decayed and released antimatter. That antimatter annihilated with matter and produced energy, a clean, extraordinarily dense energy source that also generated, as a byproduct of its nuclear properties, a localized gravitational field. He said the element could not be synthesized in a laboratory. He said it had to come from naturally occurring deposits that could only form in the environment of a high-mass stellar system, around certain kinds of old, heavy stars. The old assumption, when he said all of this in 1989, was that he had simply invented a conveniently fictional element and attached plausible-sounding physics to it. The assumption had a certain elegance, an element no one could synthesize, with properties no one could test, powering a craft no one could access, unfalsifiable in every direction. Then, in 2003, a joint team from the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research in Dubna, Russia, and Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California bombarded atoms of americium-243 with calcium-48 ions in a particle accelerator and produced for a fraction of a second a few atoms of a new heavy element. Its atomic number was 115. In 2016, the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry officially named it Moscovium and assigned it the symbol Mach element 115 was real. And here is where the vindication story becomes more complicated than Lazar's supporters usually acknowledge, and more ambiguous than his critics usually admit. The Moscovium that exists, the Moscovium that Dubna and Livermore made, is not stable. Its most durable known isotope, Moscovium-290, has a half-life of approximately 65 milliseconds. 65 thousandths of a second. The other confirmed isotopes decay faster. No stable isotope of element 115 has ever been observed, and no stable isotope is predicted to exist based on current nuclear theory. The element that exists is not the element Lazar described. His element was a fuel source capable of sustaining a reactor indefinitely. The real Moscovium vanishes before you can blink. There is an additional complication. Lazar specifically claimed that element 115 could not be synthesized in a laboratory. The 2003 synthesis directly contradicted that claim. If his knowledge came from actual classified briefings about a real exotic fuel, those briefings apparently either contained a false detail or he misremembered a significant technical constraint. The physics community also noted that the general concept of heavy elements with unusual stability properties, the theoretical island of stability around certain proton and neutron numbers in superheavy elements, was already in mainstream scientific literature by 1989. A Scientific American article discussing this island of stability in the region around element 114 was published in May 1989, the same month as Lazar's first-class TV appearance. Stanton Friedman argued directly that anyone with a working knowledge of nuclear physics could have known approximately where the next predicted heavy element would fall on the periodic table, and could have constructed the element 115 claim without any classified source. That argument is plausible. It does not fully resolve the specific technical mechanism Lazar described, the proton bombardment producing element 116 producing antimatter producing gravitational field effects, which is more elaborately specific than anything in the May 1989 Scientific American article, and which nuclear physicists have described as occupying a zone beyond casual science popularization but short of demonstrated physics. Whether that specificity represents genuine insider knowledge or very skilled extrapolation from available theory is a question the evidence cannot settle from the outside. What can be said with confidence is this: the element exists, named and cataloged, exactly where Lazar placed it on the periodic table. The element, as it exists, does not behave as he described. And when journalist Tim McMillan asked Lazar directly, years after the 2003 synthesis, whether he had ever retained any sample of element 115 from his time at S4, Lazar's answer was, "If I had some." Would I reveal it to confirm my accounts? Absolutely not. It is the kind of answer that does not close anything. In a physics laboratory in Dubna, Russia, in 2003, a particle accelerator did something that had never been done before. Scientists directed a beam of calcium-48 ions at a target made of americium-243. The collision was designed to force the nuclei of the two atoms to briefly merge, creating a new, heavier nucleus before the natural forces governing nuclear structure tore it apart. For a fraction of a second, 65 milliseconds at best, a handful of atoms existed with 115 protons in their nuclei. Then they decayed into lighter elements and vanished. The experiment was repeated, confirmed, published in 2016. The element received an official name, moscovium. Symbol macatomic number 115. 14 years earlier, on Las Vegas television, a man who said he had no verifiable degrees from any major university had described using element 115 as a fuel source aboard a craft not made by human hands. He had named the atomic number. He had described a specific nuclear reaction. He had placed it on the periodic table in a location consistent with exactly where the element was later found. And he had said in 1989 that the element could not be synthesized in any human laboratory. These facts sit next to each other without resolving into a clean story. The element 115 claim is the scientific center of Bob Lazar's account, and it is the part that has attracted the most attention since 2003 because it offers the closest thing to a testable prediction the story contains. Before 2003, supporters could not point to the element. After 2003, they pointed to it constantly. Critics responded that the prediction was not as impressive as it appeared. Both sides are partly right and partly not, and the actual situation is more interesting than either camp's version of it. Start with what Lazar described. In his early interviews with George Knapp and in subsequent appearances across 3 decades, he gave a specific account of how the propulsion system of the sport model worked. The reactor at the center of the craft, the basketball-sized device he was assigned to reverse engineer, used element 115 as its fuel. When the element was bombarded with protons, it underwent a transmutation to element 116. Element 116 was unstable and immediately decayed. That decay released antimatter, specifically positrons. Those positrons came into contact with electrons in the surrounding reactor material, and the annihilation of matter and antimatter produced pure energy in the form of gamma radiation. The reactor captured that energy and converted it to power for the craft's systems. But the energy generation was, according to Lazar, secondary to the reactor's other function. The nuclear properties of element 115, something inherent to its atomic structure rather than to any engineered component added to it, produced a localized gravitational field. This field could be amplified using the reactor geometry and directed using electromagnetic focusing systems in the craft's lower hull. The craft moved by warping the local gravitational field, falling, in a controlled sense, toward whatever direction the field was aimed. It did not push against air, it did not expel anything, it did not require a medium. It generated its own relationship with space and moved through it accordingly. Lazar said, clearly and on multiple occasions, that this element could not be synthesized in any human laboratory. The quantities aboard the craft were small, a few hundred grams as he understood it, but they had been manufactured in an environment that human particle accelerators could not replicate. The conditions required were those found around high-mass stars at the end of their lives, environments of extreme gravitational pressure and neutron flux that no terrestrial facility could approximate. The 2003 Dubna-Lawrence-Livermore synthesis directly contradicted this. A human particle accelerator did produce element 115. not in large quantities, a handful of atoms, existing for milliseconds, but it did it. The specific constraint Lazar placed on the element's origin was wrong. This matters, and the way it matters cuts in both directions. For critics, it represents a falsifiable claim that was falsified. Lazar said the element couldn't be made in a lab, and then it was made in a lab. For supporters, the response is that the element produced in Dubna was unstable moscovium with a half-life measured in fractions of a second, and Lazar's element was a stable isotope with properties no human accelerator has come close to approaching. The synthesis confirmed the element's place on the periodic table. It did not produce the element as Lazar described it. These are different claims. The island of stability concept is crucial here. Nuclear physicists have long predicted that somewhere in the region of very heavy elements, near certain magic numbers of protons and neutrons that correspond to particularly stable nuclear shell configurations, there may exist isotopes with dramatically longer half-lives than their immediate neighbors on the periodic table. The most stable known superheavy elements still decay in seconds or minutes rather than billions of years, but the theory suggests that somewhere in the heavy end of the table, stability might be recoverable. The specific location of this island has been a subject of ongoing nuclear research. Some models place it near elements 114 and 115. Others place it somewhat higher. This theoretical island is real, in the sense that mainstream nuclear physics takes it seriously as a prediction. It has never been reached experimentally. No superheavy element with the kind of stability the island predicts has ever been produced. But the concept was already in the scientific literature in 1989, and it was specifically discussed in relation to the region around element 114 in a Scientific American article published in May 1989, the same month Lazar gave his first anonymous interview to George Knapp. Stanton Friedman, who had a doctorate in nuclear physics and was deeply familiar with the superheavy element literature, argued that Lazar's element 115 claim could plausibly have been derived from publicly available scientific speculation without any classified source. The location of the next predicted heavy element was known to anyone paying attention to nuclear physics. The island of stability concept and the general idea of superheavy elements with unusual properties in that region of the table was in mainstream science publications. A person with sufficient physics knowledge could, Friedman argued, have constructed the element 115 claim from what was already out there. This is a reasonable argument. It does not fully account for the specific mechanism Lazar described, the proton bombardment sequence, the element 116 intermediate, the antimatter production. The gravitational field generation, which goes considerably beyond anything in the May 1989 Scientific American article, and involves a chain of physical claims that are not derivable from the island of stability concept alone. Whether that specificity represents classified knowledge, extraordinary extrapolation from available physics, or skilled sounding invention is genuinely unclear. What is not unclear is that when Lazar made his claims in 1989, no one had synthesized element 115 in any form. When the synthesis happened 14 years later, the element landed exactly where he said it would on the periodic table. The element as synthesized does not match his description of it. The element as he described it, stable, energy-dense, gravitationally active, has not been found anywhere. There are people in the physics community, not all of them UFO enthusiasts, who note that the island of stability remains uncharted experimental territory. The theoretical models predict its existence, but disagree about its precise location. Isotopes at the island, if they exist, might have properties qualitatively different from anything observed in the superheavy elements produced so far. No one can say with certainty what element 115 at the island of stability would or would not do, because no one has made it. The moscovium that exists is not from the island. It decays almost instantly. But the island is still, in principle, there. Lazar was asked by journalist Tim McMillan, years after the 2003 synthesis, whether he had retained any sample of element 115 from his time at S4. His response, if he had some, he would not reveal it to confirm his accounts. The answer is not evidence of anything. It is the kind of response that could come from a person protecting genuine classified material. From a person who has nothing to protect and knows that an admission of nothing would be damaging, or from a person maintaining a consistent persona across decades. It closes no door. The element he described sits on the table now, named and cataloged. It lives for 65 milliseconds, and then it is gone, whatever Lazar was describing. Whether it was a classified briefing document about a real exotic material, a sophisticated extrapolation from 1980s nuclear theory, or a carefully constructed fiction, the science has confirmed part of his claim and contradicted another part, and the part it cannot address at all is the part that matters most. A stable isotope of element 115 has never been found. No gravitational field effects have been demonstrated from any superheavy element in any laboratory. No antimatter production through the decay chain he described has been replicated. The mechanism at the heart of the sport model's propulsion system remains, from the perspective of publicly available science, undemonstrated. The element exists. It just does not do what he said. And that gap between the named thing and the described thing is where the most interesting question about Lazar's technical claims lies. Was he describing something real that human science has not yet reached? Was he describing something that sounded plausible in 1989 and turned out to be partially accurate by coincidence? Or was he describing something that was given to him in a document in a small room in a mountain in Nevada by people who may or may not have been telling him the truth about what they had? He said he read briefing documents at S4. Documents that described, in the language of a classified program, not just the element and the craft, but the beings who built them, and a history of their relationship with Earth that stretched back 10,000 years. There was a room adjacent to the hangar. Not the hangar itself, not the space where the craft sat on its platform, but a smaller room off to the side, a briefing room in the functional sense, a space set aside for the transmission of classified information rather than the conduct of classified work. This is where Lazar said he was taken, on multiple occasions during his time at S4, to read documents relevant to his assignment. The operative word is read. He was not permitted to take notes. He was not permitted to remove materials. His clearance, which he described as extending substantially above the Q clearance used by the Department of Energy for nuclear programs, through multiple additional layers of compartmentalization, allowed him to read specific documents while inside the facility and to retain what he could in memory. When he left the room, the documents stayed. What he described reading was, depending on your starting position, either the most significant body of classified information in human history or the content of conspiracy literature that had been circulating in UFO research circles for at least 2 years before he appeared on television. The gap between those two interpretations has not closed. The briefing documents, as Lazar recounted them, covered several categories of information. The first concerned the craft themselves, their origin, their operational principles, their physical properties. The second concerned the beings who had built them, described in the documents, as Lazar recalled, as small gray entities with large craniums and reduced facial features, said to originate from a binary star system in the constellation Reticulum called Zeta Reticuli. The third, and most explosive in its implications, concerned the relationship between these beings and Earth over an extended period of time. The documents described, according to Lazar, an involvement between these beings and the human species stretching back approximately 10,000 years. The nature of that involvement included participation in, or influence over, human genetic development. The language he recalled was the language of a classified program, summarizing an established body of knowledge rather than speculating about new findings. The program was not new. The knowledge was not recent. Whatever was being studied at S4 had a documented history behind it. Lazar was careful, consistently, to frame these claims as the content of documents he read rather than things he personally witnessed or verified. He saw the craft. He worked on the propulsion system. He read certain materials. He cannot confirm the documents were accurate. He can only report what they said. This distinction matters enormously, and it is one of the places where serious analysis of his account tends to be most careful. The physical details, the craft, the reactor, the lighting, the seats, the element, are claims about things Lazar personally observed. The briefing document content is a claim about what a classified program's written materials said. those are epistemically different. A person could accurately recall what a document said without that document being accurate. A classified program could have produced briefing materials containing genuine operational information alongside information that was false, exaggerated, or deliberately misleading. The document chain is not the evidence chain. The old assumption about the briefing documents was that they were simply invented and that the invention followed a specific template. The Majestic 12 documents, a set of alleged classified files concerning the recovery and study of extraterrestrial technology, purportedly dating to the Truman administration, had surfaced in UFO research circles in 1987. 2 years before Lazar first appeared on television, the MJ-12 documents described small gray entities, Zeta Reticuli origins, long-term government concealment, and a program of study that had been running since the late 1940s. Most serious investigators, including many committed to the reality of UFO phenomena, consider the MJ-12 documents to be forgeries. The specific claims in them, gray entities, Zeta Reticuli, genetic experimentation, decade-spanning programs, were already circulating. John Lear had been publicly making claims along these lines before Lazar met him in 1988. Lear's framework included alien craft in government possession, long-standing cover-ups, and descriptions of the beings involved that overlapped with what Lazar said the S4 documents contained. Lazar acknowledged, across his years of interviews, that Lear was a significant presence in his life during the period when he went public, and that the overlap between Lear's public claims and his own briefing document descriptions looked suspicious from the outside. He said the overlap felt to him like corroboration, that hearing Lear's claims made him feel he was not alone in what he knew, but he acknowledged the legitimate concern that Lear may have contaminated his memory of the documents, or that the documents themselves may have contained material designed to align with existing UFO mythology. That second possibility is the one George Knapp has returned to publicly on multiple occasions. Knapp's disinformation hypothesis, which he raised not as a definitive explanation, but as one that had to be taken seriously, was that Lazar's briefing documents may have been real classified documents containing deliberately false or amplified information. The idea is not that Lazar invented the documents. The idea is that the documents were real documents in a real program, and that their content was engineered to create a specific narrative. A narrative that would, if it escaped the facility, be both compelling enough to spread and impossible enough to verify. A real classified program with real craft of unclear origin might generate briefing materials that contextualize those craft in ways that serve the program's security interests. If you want people who might come forward to sound unreliable, you include enough material in their briefings that their accounts, when disclosed, will contain claims too dramatic to be believed by the mainstream and too specific to be dismissed by the fringe. You give them the gray entities. You give them the 10,000-year history. You give them the genetic manipulation. And then you ensure their credentials are questionable enough that no serious institution will pick up the thread. The physical format of the briefing documents, as distinct from their content, is one detail that some former intelligence community members have noted. Lazar's description of how the documents were structured, the format of the cover pages, the way information was organized for compartmentalized reading, was described by some individuals who reviewed the 2018 Corbell documentary as consistent with how real Special Access Program briefings are actually formatted. This is not confirmation of content. It is a comment on format. But format is harder to fake convincingly than content, because content can be borrowed from existing mythology, while format requires specific procedural knowledge of how classified programs actually organize their materials. Lazar produced no copies. There are no photographs of the documents. No corroborating witnesses saw him read them. The physical evidence for the briefing room, the documents, and their contents is, in the strictest sense, zero. What exists is Lazar's memory of what he read, reported consistently over 37 years, with no access to the originals to check his recall against. And yet the documents, if real, would not be evidence of alien contact. They would be evidence that a classified program believed it had sufficient information to produce briefings claiming alien contact. Those are not the same thing. A program that recovered craft of unknown origin might generate briefing materials, making claims about those craft that exceed what the physical evidence could actually support. The contents of a classified document are not automatically true. They reflect what the program's authors understood, or wanted readers to understand, or chose to include for reasons that may not be apparent to the reader. Lazar may have read what he said he read. The documents may have said what he said they said. Both of those things could be true. And the documents could still have been wrong about the 10,000-year history and the entities from Zeta Reticuli. The physical existence of the briefing room is a different question from the accuracy of what was briefed inside it. What remained after Lazar went public was a question that had no clean answer if the briefing documents described a program that had been running for decades. Who else had worked inside it? Were there other scientists, other engineers, other technicians who had sat in that room and read the same cover sheets and been escorted back to the hangar afterward? Had any of them ever tried, before or after Lazar, to talk about what they had seen? The evidence for other voices was thin, scattered, and consistently difficult to verify. But the pressure that seemed to fall on people who got close enough to the story to constitute a threat, that was something Knapp had experienced firsthand, and it followed a pattern that did not feel like the routine response to a lone fabricator. 3 Wednesday evenings. That is the physical evidence base for what Lazar's supporters often describe as the strongest corroboration of his account, and what his critics describe as 3 people standing in a dark desert, seeing lights they could not identify, and deciding, because one of them had told them what to expect, that the lights were what he said they were. The story of the Wednesday nights begins with Lazar telling someone. Before he ever appeared on television, before George Knapp's name was attached to any of it, Lazar told his closest friend what he had seen at S4. That friend was Gene Huff, a real estate appraiser, not a physicist, not a military contractor, not a UFO researcher. Huff had no professional investment in the story being true, and no reason to invent one. He listened to what Lazar told him about S4, about the craft, about the propulsion system and the element and the briefing documents, and he believed him. Not because he had independent evidence, because he knew Bob Lazar, and because the specific texture of what Lazar was describing. The awkward physical details, the practical frustrations of trying to understand a system with no reference points, felt to Huff like the texture of a man describing something real. John Lear came into it through the connection that had already brought Lazar to George Knapp's attention. Lear was a different kind of witness. A man with his own elaborate and publicly stated beliefs about alien craft and government cover-ups, which made him both a more credentialed observer in terms of aviation experience and institutional knowledge, and a less reliable one in terms of objectivity. Lear had concluded that the government possessed extraterrestrial craft before he ever met Bob Lazar. His corroboration of anything Lazar told him was therefore not independent corroboration. It was confirmation from a man who was already looking for confirmation. Lazar told them he could get them close enough to see, not inside. He wasn't offering anyone access to S4. But the craft were test flown, he said, on Wednesday evenings. And the test flights were visible from outside the restricted perimeter if you positioned yourself correctly and went at the right time. He gave them the schedule not in the vague way of someone offering a possible coincidence, but in the specific way of a person who had been told, within the program, when the tests were scheduled. They went on 3 Wednesdays. Route 375 in Nevada, later designated the extraterrestrial highway after Lazar's story helped make the area a destination, runs through the flat basin country east of the Groom Lake restricted zone. If you position yourself at certain points along it, or the dirt roads branching from it, you can see the ridgeline under which, according to Lazar, S4 was located. You cannot see over or through the ridgeline. You can see the airspace above it. On 3 Wednesday evenings in the early months of 1989, Lazar took Huff and Lear to such a position. What they saw, all 3 of them, on all 3 nights, was lights. Lights moving over the ridgeline in ways that did not match the behavior of conventional aircraft they were familiar with. The specifics of what they observed varied somewhat across accounts. Huff's description of the 3rd Wednesday, when later pressed, was described by some researchers as less dramatic than the version Lazar has told on podcasts and in interviews in recent years. Gene Huff did not claim to have seen a disc-shaped craft performing impossible maneuvers. He described lights that moved in ways he found difficult to explain with reference to conventional aviation. John Lear, with his aviation background and his existing conviction, went considerably further in his interpretation. On the third Wednesday, a Lincoln County Sheriff's deputy appeared behind them. The group had been on or near a public road, but their presence in that specific location at that specific time was apparently noticed. The deputy took identification from everyone present. He was polite. There was no incident. He drove away. The identification check is the piece of this that Lazar has consistently said marked the end of his employment at S4. Within days, he received a call. He was told his access was terminated. He was brought in for a conversation that he described as a warning, a clear and unambiguous statement that he had created a problem by bringing people to observe restricted test activities. He described being told, in whatever language the program used for such occasions, that he was now a liability and that his cooperation with discretion would be in his own interest. Knapp had a similar experience. After beginning his investigation of the Lazar story and making inquiries to government agencies, military offices, and intelligence-connected individuals, Knapp noticed he was being followed. The surveillance was not subtle enough to be deniable. He described specific instances of being watched and tracked in ways that went well beyond coincidence. A journalist with Knapp's credentials and institutional affiliation being obviously surveilled after beginning a story about a classified program in the Nevada desert creates its own evidentiary problem. The government does not typically deploy surveillance resources against journalists reporting fabricated stories. The cost-benefit calculation doesn't support it. The most straightforward interpretation of the Wednesday night sequence is that 3 people stood in the dark near a classified test range, saw lights they couldn't identify, and interpreted them through the framework Lazar had provided. This interpretation is not unreasonable. The Nellis Range is one of the most active airspace management zones in the country. Classified conventional aircraft have been tested there for decades. Lights in the night sky over restricted desert airspace have explanations that do not require alien propulsion. Lear, in particular, was the worst possible independent witness, a man committed to a conclusion before he saw a single light. But the prediction element is what makes this harder to dismiss than the lights themselves. Lazar did not say there might be something to see on a Wednesday evening if they were lucky. He gave them a specific schedule. He told them when to go. And something was there. On the nights he said something would be there, behaving in ways they found unusual. If he was fabricating the entire story, he had either extraordinary luck on 3 consecutive Wednesdays, or he had access to classified test flight schedules through some means other than working at S4. The second possibility is not obviously simpler than the first. The government's response to the deputy's identification report, ending Lazar's access, issuing what he describes as a direct warning, and apparently surveilling the journalist covering the story, implies a level of institutional attention that seems disproportionate to the threat posed by a delusional liar. Organizations are generally not inclined to spend resources tracking people who have no credible information. The tracking and termination would make more sense if what Lazar was saying had some operational connection to something that actually existed. Gene Huff has not changed his account in any significant way across 37 years. He still says he was there, that Lazar told him in advance what they would see, and that what they saw was not explicable as ordinary aircraft behavior. He has no book deal from his involvement in this story, no documentary career, no ongoing public profile as a UFO witness. He is a person who was in a desert on 3 Wednesday nights in early 1989 and cannot explain what he saw in any satisfying way, and has said so consistently. After the third Wednesday, the door to S4 closed. Lazar never went back. The 9 craft, the reactor, the briefing room, the documents, all of it remained behind a perimeter he could no longer cross. What he had when he walked out of that program was his memory and 1 piece of paper. The paper listed his employer as the United States Department of Naval Intelligence. And when investigators tried to follow that thread, to verify the employer identification number, to confirm the address, to establish through normal bureaucratic channels that this paycheck had been issued by a real organization, they found that the paper was real and the trail behind it dissolved. A W-2 form is a mundane document. It is the annual wage statement that American employers are required by the Internal Revenue Service to issue to their employees, confirming taxable wages and withholdings for the previous calendar year. It has a specific format. It contains specific fields, employee name, employee address, employer name, employer address, and employer identification number. The EIN, a 9-digit code assigned by the heirs to identify each business or organization in the tax system. A W-2 form is not proof of interesting employment. Millions of them are issued every year by organizations ranging from corner diners to federal agencies. It is, ordinarily, the most boring document in a person's paper life. Bob Lazar has one. He produced it when George Knapp began investigating his background. It is a real document, in the physical sense: paper, ink, printed fields, filled-in values. The employer name on it is the United States Department of Naval Intelligence. When the heirs was asked, in 1991, to verify the employer identification number listed on that form, the agency could not validate it. The EIN did not match any organization in the heirs database in the way a genuine 9-digit federal identifier should. The payroll source that issued the W-2, whatever it was, did not appear in the normal machinery of federal employment records in the way that government employment normally appears. This is either a forgery or evidence of a compartmentalized payroll system operating outside normal government accounting infrastructure, or something in between. There is no clean resolution. The form exists. The employer it names exists as an organization. The number used to identify that employer cannot be traced through normal channels, and in a story that has been defined since 1989. By the systematic absence of documentation that should exist, one more document whose verification trail dissolves is either perfectly consistent with a fabricated biography or perfectly consistent with a biography that has been administratively obscured. The missing record problem runs through every institutional category of Lazar's life with a consistency that is either the pattern of a thorough liar or the pattern of something more deliberate. MIT, no record. Caltech, no record. The absences there are most simply explained by the records never having existed, because the records were never generated, because Lazar never attended those institutions. Stanton Friedman traced him to Pierce Junior College and found enrollment there that overlapped with the MIT period. A person cannot attend Pierce in Los Angeles and MIT in Massachusetts simultaneously. Friedman, who wanted Lazar's credentials to be real because he wanted the underlying story to be real, concluded with some frustration that the MIT and Caltech claims were false. This is the most straightforward explanation for those specific absences, and it remains the most defensible one. Los Alamos is different. Los Alamos initially said it had no record. Then a 1982 internal phone directory was produced that listed Lazar by name. Then a local newspaper article from June of the same year described him in print as a physicist at the Messen Physics Facility. The institution that said it had no record had, preserved in its own internal documentation, a record. When confronted with this, Los Alamos did not revise its position so much as it shifted the characterization of the connection Lazar's role there became. In subsequent accounts, that of a technician or subcontractor rather than a directly employed physicist. That distinction matters for his credentials. It does not explain why the initial position was that no record existed at all. The pattern of the Los Alamos response is specific. Deny first, then acknowledge a diminished version of the connection when the denial cannot be sustained. This is not how organizations respond to claims about people who were never there. If someone claims to have worked at a major national laboratory as a senior physicist and the claim is false, the laboratory can demonstrate the falsity by producing its own records, which will show no physicist by that name. The laboratory does not first deny having any record and then produce a phone directory with his name in it. Lazar's description of his own record situation was that they had been removed. He said he called the institutions himself after going public and found nothing. His birth records were reportedly inaccessible at one point. His social security record showed, in the years when he claimed to be employed at S4, a period of employment whose origin he attributed to the Naval Intelligence connection. The gaps and partial presences in his paper trail were, he said, the result of deliberate administrative action taken against him after he became a liability. The CIA declassification of Area 51 in 2013 established, in the documentary record, something relevant to evaluating this claim. When the CIA released historical materials about Groom Lake as part of a Freedom of Information Act response, the released documents confirmed that the government had systematically denied the existence of a facility that thousands of people had worked at for decades. Pilots who had observed the U-2 test flights from commercial aircraft had reported seeing something unusual, and those reports had been categorized and managed rather than addressed transparently. The government had lied, repeatedly and as a matter of deliberate policy, about the existence of a place that had runways and cafeterias and employee buses. The state secrets doctrine had been invoked in federal court to prevent discussion of the facility's operations. Presidential exemptions had been signed to shield it from normal oversight. This is the documented institutional environment within which Lazar claimed to work. An environment where the existence of a real facility with real employees was, as official policy, denied to the public, to journalists, and to courts. Within that environment, the administrative removal of one employee's records or the establishment of a payroll system operating outside normal federal accounting is not a logistically implausible action. It is, in fact, precisely the kind of action that a program operating with the secrecy level the CIA's own documents describe as normal for Groom Lake would have the infrastructure and the institutional precedent to perform. That does not prove the records were removed. It establishes that removal was institutionally possible within a context where the government's documented behavior was precisely removal and denial. There is a concept in intelligence tradecraft called a legend. A legend is a constructed biography, a cover identity built around enough real material to survive the kind of scrutiny it will typically face, while being designed to collapse under the deeper scrutiny it was not intended to face. A legend for an intelligence operative might include real employment at a real institution, real addresses, real contacts, real institutional traces, alongside fabricated credentials and employment history in the areas that need to be obscured. The real elements provide the texture of authenticity. The fabricated elements provide the cover. The combination is designed to be convincing at first pass and frustrating at deeper examination, not because it falls apart completely, but because it never quite resolves into either full confirmation or full denial. If Lazar's background is a legend, and this is one hypothesis, not a conclusion, it was a very specific kind of legend. It contained enough real material to give Knapp, a rigorous investigative journalist, enough initial purchase to take the story seriously. It contained credential claims false enough that sustained investigation would permanently compromise the witness's authority. It contained operational details accurate enough that they would continue to match future disclosures, keeping the story alive in ways that served whatever purpose the story was intended to serve. John Andrews, an aviation researcher who investigated Lazar's claims in 1990 and 1991, conducted correspondence with various military and government offices trying to trace the W-2 and the employment chain. In documents he produced, and which later circulated through researcher networks, he described a payroll listing for Lazar in which the cost center designation, the field that normally identifies the government department or program funding the salary, carried not a departmental code, but a word, majestic. This claim is third-hand, based on Andrews' correspondence rather than any document he produced. And it has no independent verification. It may be accurate. It may be a researcher's interpretation of something ambiguous. It may be false. But it is consistent with what other researchers and investigators who have probed the Lazar employment chain have encountered. A trail that leads somewhere and then stops, at a wall that looks exactly like the wall you would construct if you wanted a trail to stop there. The 1990 conviction complicated everything. Lazar pleaded guilty to felony pandering. He had been connected to the operation of a legal brothel in Nevada in a way that crossed into criminal territory. He received community service, a requirement to undergo psychotherapy, and a prohibition from visiting brothels. His critics used this extensively. A man who operates a prostitution business is not a reliable narrator. A man whose credentials are fabricated and whose legal history includes a felony conviction, is the worst possible witness to the most sensitive classified program in American history. Every element of his biography seems engineered to ensure that whatever he says, the tools to dismiss him are already in place. That may be coincidence. People have complicated lives, and having a complicated life does not make a person's unrelated claims false. Or it may be exactly what you would want if you needed the world to stop listening to someone. The records didn't simply fail to appear. They appeared in pieces, a phone directory here, a newspaper article there, and then the institutions that held them retreated. The W-2 names an employer that exists and carries a number that can't be traced. The trail doesn't go nowhere. It goes somewhere, and then it stops, at a door that doesn't open. In intelligence work, that is sometimes how you know the door matters. December 16th, 2017, a Sunday. The front page of the New York Times carried a story that had been in preparation for months. Drawing on sources within the Pentagon, documentation from government budget records, and testimony from military personnel whose accounts had been verified through standard journalistic practice. The headline described a secret government program devoted to the investigation of unidentified aerial phenomena. The program was called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Its budget, allocated without public disclosure or congressional debate in the ordinary sense, had been approximately $22 million per year. It had been operating since at least 2007, and it had been housed within the Pentagon's organizational structure under the Office of Naval Intelligence, the same edition of the newspaper published. For the first time in mainstream American media, 3 videos captured by Navy aircraft sensors. The clips were short, blurry in the way that infrared targeting cameras produce when tracking a fast-moving object against an open sky, and they showed objects behaving in ways that Navy pilots found inexplicable. One clip, the footage from an encounter in 2004 near the Nimitz off the California coast, showed a smooth, featureless oval object hovering over the ocean surface before accelerating upward so rapidly that the camera struggled to track it. The pilot who had encountered that object, retired Commander David Fravor, had filed no formal report at the time because there was no mechanism for reporting something for which no category existed. He described, in interviews around the documentary release that accompanied the Times story, a craft that had no wings, no exhaust, no discernible propulsion system. And that had covered approximately 60 miles of ocean in under a minute. When Bob Lazar was shown that footage for the first time, his response was immediate. The craft in the video reminded him, he said, of the sport model. This convergence between the 2004 Tic Tac encounter as captured on Navy sensor footage and the craft Lazar had described from memory since 1989 does not prove the objects are the same. A smooth oval craft is not a uniquely specific description, but Fravor's account of the Tic Tac's behavior matches, at a structural level. The operating principles, Lazar said, govern the sport model: no propulsion system visible, acceleration without apparent inertial effects, transition from hover to extreme velocity without the kind of trajectory curve that aerodynamic lift requires. Fravor himself said publicly that he believed what he had encountered was not made on Earth. His background: career Navy fighter pilot, commander of a carrier strike group's aerial combat unit, trained in exactly the kind of observation and reporting that military aviation demands, made him a fundamentally different kind of witness from any that the UFO field had previously produced. The 2017 Times story changed the landscape of what could be said publicly about government interest in unidentified aerial phenomena. Before December 2017, the official position, the position that had been officially maintained for decades, was that the United States government had no active program studying UAPs, that previous investigations had concluded the phenomena were explicable as misidentified conventional objects or natural phenomena, and that continued interest in the subject was not supported by any credible evidence base. After December 2017, that position was no longer tenable. ATIP had existed. It had spent money. It had collected data. Its director, Luis Elizondo, had resigned in protest over what he described as internal resistance to taking the subject seriously, and had subsequently spoken on the record about his belief that some of the objects in the ATIP database were not of human manufacture. The specific institutional home of ATIP, the Office of Naval Intelligence, had been identified by Lazar as his employer in 1989, 28 years earlier. He had told this to George Knapp in the same period when Knapp was verifying the rest of his background, when the credential problems were already apparent, when the story was already difficult to assess. The Navy in the Nevada desert had seemed like one of the story's more obvious errors. By 2017, it was confirmed as the correct institutional home for exactly the kind of program Lazar had described. The escalation continued. In June 2023, a former U.S. Air Force intelligence officer named David Grush went on the record with a story published by investigative journalists Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal, the same Blumenthal who had co-authored the 2017 Times piece, describing a classified program far more extensive than ATIP. Grush was not a UFO enthusiast in the casual sense. He had served in the Air Force for 14 years, reaching the rank of major, and had spent the most recent years of his career as the National Reconnaissance Office's representative to the UAP task force. The Pentagon body, established specifically to investigate unidentified aerial phenomena. His security clearances, he said, had extended across relevant classified compartments. He had spent 4 years interviewing more than 40 individuals with claimed knowledge of programs he was assigned to assess. What Grush said, and then repeated under oath before a House Oversight Subcommittee on July 26, 2023, was that the United States government had operated a multi-decade OPE crash retrieval and reverse engineering program. Not a study program, a retrieval program. A program that had physically recovered craft of non-human origin and was attempting to understand them. He said he had been denied access to the specific programs when he attempted to review them through his official channels. He said the programs had been shielded from congressional oversight through misappropriation of funds and administrative structures designed to keep them below the visibility threshold of normal intelligence oversight. He said he knew, from his 4 years of interviews, the locations of specific facilities where retrieved materials or craft were held. Among the locations he cited, S4 at Papoose Lake. The specific facility Bob Lazar had described on Las Vegas television in 1989, the facility whose existence had never been officially confirmed, was named in sworn congressional testimony in 2023 by a former Air Force intelligence officer who said it was one of the sites associated with the government's non-human craft retrieval program. The Pentagon denied Grush's claims. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, ATIP's successor, stated that it had found no verifiable information to substantiate claims that any program involving the possession or reverse engineering of extraterrestrial materials had existed or currently existed. General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said in an August 2023 interview that he had never encountered evidence supporting Grush's allegations. NASA's independent UAP study team concluded that it had found no credible evidence of extraterrestrial activity. Scientists pointed to Grush's admission that he had not personally seen any craft or recovered materials, and that his account was based on what others had told him rather than direct observation. These are significant limitations. Grush's testimony was testimony about testimony. He interviewed people who told him things. He reviewed documents that he said supported those accounts. He has not produced the documents. He has not produced the witnesses. He repeated several times during the congressional hearing that he could only elaborate in a SIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility, and that he was constrained from public disclosure by classification obligations. Congress was subsequently denied access to a SIF for further questioning. The closed door appeared again. The pattern of the 2023 hearing, a credentialed insider making specific claims about classified programs, declining to provide specifics in public on classification grounds, offering to elaborate in secure settings, having those secure settings denied or restricted, echoed in its structural shape what Lazar had experienced 34 years earlier. A man with institutional credentials describes something that should be in the institutional record. The institution denies it. The secure setting where it could be verified remains inaccessible. The door stays closed. What can be said, without overclaiming, about the relationship between 2017 and 1989 and 2023 is this. Lazar's external frame, the institutional framework of his story. The claim that the Navy ran these programs, that reverse engineering was occurring, that specific facilities existed for the purpose of studying retrieved craft, has been approached and sometimes echoed by official government disclosures and sworn testimony in ways that would have seemed absurd if predicted in 1989. That does not confirm the craft. It does not confirm S4. It does not confirm the sport model or the reactor or the element or the briefing documents, but it means that the framework within which those claims exist is no longer fantasy. It is, in its broad contours, the framework that official Washington has been slowly, reluctantly, partially acknowledging, and the SIF door that closed on Grush's further testimony was in its way. The same door that has been closing on this story since May 15, 1989, there is a third explanation for Bob Lazar's story, and it is in some ways more unsettling than either of the two that dominate the debate. The first explanation is that Lazar is telling the truth. He worked at S4. He saw 9 craft. He worked on the propulsion system of one of them. He read the briefing documents. The government erased his records. Everything he described is real. The second explanation is that Lazar fabricated the story. He never worked at S4. He built a plausible-sounding fiction from available sources, the Los Alamos connection, the UFO research literature, the nuclear physics he had absorbed from somewhere, the operational details of the Nellis Range that could be pieced together from publicly available aerospace reporting. The credential problems are the simplest evidence for this. The man lied about MIT and Caltech, and someone willing to lie about that is capable of lying about the rest. The third explanation is the one George Knapp, the journalist who has spent more time on this story than anyone outside of Lazar himself, has raised on multiple occasions, never as a conclusion, but as a possibility he cannot rule out. It goes like this. Lazar told the truth about what he experienced, and what he experienced was designed. The concept of a legend in intelligence work is more flexible than its most common application suggests. A legend is usually discussed as a tool for placing an operative in a false identity, a constructed biography that allows a person to pass as someone they are not. But the same logic can be applied to a disclosure program. If you need the public's attention to land in a specific place and stay there, and you need that attention to be self-discrediting enough that serious institutions will not pursue it, you can construct a disclosure that works exactly like a legend. You build it around enough real material that it cannot be dismissed as pure fiction. You embed it in enough impossible to verify or demonstrably false claims that sustained investigation destroys the messenger. You select a disclosure whose background is compromised enough to serve as a permanent caveat, degree claims that don't check out, a criminal conviction, a personality profile that invites dismissal, and then you let it run. The CIA's own historical records contain documentation of exactly this kind of operation applied to UFO phenomena, though in a less elaborate form. During the 1950s and 1960s, a significant fraction of UFO sighting reports from civilian pilots and observers in the American Southwest were generated by sightings of U-2 and SR-71 reconnaissance aircraft operating at altitudes and speeds that no publicly known aircraft of the period could achieve. The CIA was aware that these sightings were producing UFO reports. Rather than correcting the misidentification, which would have revealed the existence of programs the agency needed to keep classified, the CIA allowed the reports to stand. Let the public think they were seeing flying saucers. The flying saucer explanation was, from the agency's perspective, preferable to the correct explanation. This is documented in the CIA's own declassified history. That was passive disinformation, the deliberate non-correction of a false belief because the false belief was operationally preferable to the true one. The Lazar hypothesis, if it is disinformation, represents active disinformation, the deliberate construction and seeding of a false narrative designed to achieve a specific protective effect. What would that effect be? Knapp's version of the hypothesis suggests that S4, or something at Papoose Lake, or something at the edge of the Nellis Range in that area, was being used for something that the government wanted kept strictly away from public knowledge, not necessarily alien craft. Possibly highly classified conventional programs whose existence, if it became known, would be more damaging than the alien story. By seeding the alien story through a discreditable witness, you ensure that anyone who stumbles onto real evidence of the real program will find themselves in a landscape already dominated by a narrative that mainstream institutions have been trained to dismiss. The alien story becomes a permanent inoculation against credibility for anyone investigating that region. The architecture of this hypothesis is elegant, but it has a serious weakness, and it is the same weakness that makes the whole story so difficult to finally put down. If Lazar's account was disinformation, if the story was engineered from outside, then the people who engineered it had to give Lazar something real enough to sustain his account across 37 years of investigation without contradicting itself. They had to brief him convincingly on operational details he could not have otherwise known: the Janet airline system, the EG&G hiring mechanism, the Navy's institutional role, the S4 location. They had to give him a W-2 from an employer that exists. They had to create enough of a paper trail to keep the story plausible while ensuring it could never be fully confirmed. That is an extraordinarily complex operation to run for a story you ultimately want dismissed. Normally, disinformation is cheap, you seed a false claim, it circulates, it distracts attention, you move on. The kind of infrastructure implied by Lazar's account being designed disinformation would require resources, coordination across multiple agencies, and a level of long-range operational planning that would itself be remarkable. Organizations capable of that kind of operation do not typically waste it on a single Las Vegas TV broadcast. And then there is the Wednesday schedule. If Lazar's story was engineered, whoever engineered it had to give him a real schedule for real test flights over the Nellis Range on Wednesday evenings, so that when he brought witnesses out to observe, there would actually be something to observe. That means the test flights were real, which means the craft were real, which means there was something at Papoose Lake worth protecting with the kind of disinformation operation the hypothesis describes. At which point, the disinformation hypothesis and the truth hypothesis begin to converge. And the question becomes not whether something was there, but what it was. Lazar himself has rejected the disinformation interpretation consistently. He says what he saw was what he saw. He worked on a craft. The craft was real. The element was real. The briefing documents were real, though he acknowledges he cannot guarantee their accuracy. He is not a man who has made the UFO world his career. He runs a scientific supply company in Michigan called United Nuclear. He builds unusual vehicles in his garage. He gives occasional interviews when documentaries require it. His 2026 Joe Rogan appearance, accompanying the release of S4, the Bob Lazar story, found him older and quieter than his 1989 broadcasts, saying the same things in essentially the same words, noting that he regrets having left the project at S4, noting that he never made money from the Corbell documentary, noting that the 37 years since he first went on television have not changed what he saw. Gene Huff has not changed his position. The person who knows Bob Lazar best, who heard the story before anyone outside S4 was supposed to know it, still believes him. This is not evidence in the formal sense. People can be wrong about the people they know best, but it is a data point about the internal consistency of Lazar's account across the range of his personal relationships, a consistency that runs in the opposite direction from what you typically observe in people who have built their lives around a fabricated identity. The 2017 FBI and Michigan State Police raid on United Nuclear, Lazar's company, searched in connection with a case involving thallium sulfate, a poison linked to a suspicious death, produced no charges against Lazar but renewed claims from people who found the timing suspicious that his continued legal exposure reflected ongoing government attention to his activities. The investigators said they were looking for a chemical. Skeptics noted that the raid was an unrelated law enforcement action in a completely different matter. Supporters noted that the raid came precisely as public attention to OAT programs was reaching its highest point in decades and found the timing difficult to dismiss. The disinformation hypothesis cannot be proven. It also cannot be disproven. It is the kind of explanation that, once considered, makes a specific kind of sense and then refuses to be unseen. A story engineered to be believed by some and dismissed by most, surviving for decades in exactly the zone of ambiguity that keeps it alive without allowing it to be resolved. That is a description of what the Lazar story has been since 1989. Whether it was built that way deliberately or arrived at that condition through the ordinary chaos of a complicated person's complicated life is the question the evidence cannot settle. What can be settled or approached is what happened after Lazar's story entered the world. What changed? What the disclosure landscape looks like now. Compared to where it was when a shadowed face appeared on a Las Vegas television screen and said 9 craft were stored in a mountain in the Nevada desert. Return to the studio. May 15th, 1989, the 5 o'clock news. A shadow on the screen and a false name in the chyron, and a voice describing things that had no place in the official version of the world. The phones rang before the segment was over. The switchboard lit up across the building, in the control room, in the hallway, at the anchor desk. People stood and looked at each other and did not have a clean response to what they had just broadcast. The story went out over Las Vegas and kept going, to the rest of the country that evening, to Europe within days, to Japan within the same week. The broadcast is 37 years old now. The man who sat in that chair is in his mid-60s. He appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast on April 3rd, 2026, alongside Luigi Venditelli, the director of S4, The Bob Lazar Story, released the same day on Amazon Prime. He said on that broadcast that he regrets leaving the project at S4. He said he never made $1 from the Corbell documentary. He said the same things in the same words with the same specific physical details that he said in 1989. The reactor was the size of a basketball. The seats were too small. The light inside the craft did not fill the space the way it should have. The element was 115. Nothing in the physical description has changed in 37 years of interviews. This is either the most sustained and disciplined fabrication in the history of UFO claims. A man who constructed a false story in 1989 and has maintained it without significant contradiction across hundreds of interviews, 2 documentaries, multiple congressional disclosure cycles, and his own 4th decade recollection, or it is a person describing what they remember, with the consistency that genuine memory tends to produce when it is not being actively maintained but simply recalled. Look at what the world knew in 1989 and what it knows now. In 1989, Area 51 did not officially exist. The government denied the facility. In 2013, the CIA released historical documents acknowledging Groom Lake's existence and operational history. The denial was documented. The facility was real. The thousands of people who had worked there had worked at a place the government spent decades pretending was not there. In 1989, the claim that the government had a secret program studying unidentified aerial phenomena was the claim of conspiracy theorists and fringe researchers. In 2017, the New York Times published confirmation that ADIP had been operating under the Office of Naval Intelligence for years, with a real budget and real personnel and real data. The claim that a program existed was confirmed. The claim that it was Navy-run was confirmed. Lazar had identified the Navy as his employer's institutional home 28 years before that confirmation. In 2019, the Pentagon officially released and authenticated the FLIR, Gimbal, and GoFast videos, footage from Navy aircraft sensors showing objects that exhibited no visible propulsion system, produced no heat signature consistent with known engines, and performed maneuvers that could not be explained by any publicly acknowledged human aerospace capability. Commander David Fravor, who encountered the Tic Tac off the California coast in 2004, stated his belief that the craft was not manufactured on Earth. When Lazar was shown the footage, he said it resembled the sport model, not an identical craft. A resemblance in operating principle, the absence of propulsion signatures, the way it moved. In 2023, a former Air Force intelligence officer testified under oath before Congress that the government had operated a multi-decade crash retrieval and reverse engineering program. He named specific locations where retrieved materials or craft were said to be held. One of the locations he named was S4 at Papoose Lake. The specific facility Lazar had described on Las Vegas television in 1989 was cited in sworn congressional testimony in 2023 by a man whose security clearances and institutional access were a matter of official record. The Pentagon denied the claims. Congress was denied the SIF access that would have allowed further questioning. The door stayed closed. Against this accumulation of external corroboration, the center of the story remains what it has always been: unverified. No photograph of the interior of the sport model has ever been produced. No material sample from S4 has ever been authenticated. No second technician or engineer from the reverse engineering program has come forward with corroborating direct observation of the craft. The briefing documents have never been recovered or confirmed. The 9 hangars remain, on every available satellite image, invisible, either because they don't exist or because they were successfully concealed, and there is no method available to the public to determine which. The element 115 that exists, moscovium, officially named in 2016, decays in milliseconds and has none of the properties Lazar described. The honest accounting of the story in 2026 is this: everything around Lazar's core claims has moved toward confirmation. The institution he named as his employer runs the classified UAP programs. The base he described was real and was officially denied for decades. The Navy's operational role in UAP programs was confirmed. The existence of reverse engineering programs was alleged under oath before Congress by a credentialed intelligence officer. And the specific thing at the center, the craft, the element, the propulsion, the briefing documents about 10,000 years of alien contact, remains exactly where it has always been, behind a door that does not open. The 2026 Venditelli documentary attempted, in one of its more unusual production decisions, to build a faithful physical recreation of the interior of the sport model as Lazar described it. The team used Unreal Engine 5, the most sophisticated real-time rendering technology available in commercial production, and they built the interior to the dimensions and specifications Lazar had provided across his interviews. They placed halogen lamps inside the recreation in the positions he described, and they found, when they looked at what they had built, that the lighting behaved as Lazar said it would, illuminating the surfaces it was directed at while leaving the surrounding space darker than they expected, darker than a normally enclosed space of those dimensions would be under that light load. Venditelli described this as one of the moments during production when he felt least confident that Lazar had simply invented the description. You can borrow the dramatic elements of a spacecraft description from science fiction. You can extrapolate the physics from academic papers. What you cannot easily do is describe in passing and without emphasis a specific and unintuitive behavior of light inside an enclosed space that turns out to be reproducible when someone tries to build the space as described. That detail did not appear in science fiction. It did not appear in the UFO literature. It appeared in Lazar's accounts as a practical observation. The light doesn't work the way you'd expect in there, and it showed up again in a production studio in 2026 when a filmmaker tried to replicate what he described. This is not proof. It is one data point about the internal consistency of a description given by a person with unverifiable credentials about an unverifiable location. It is the kind of thing that makes the simple dismissal harder than it looked in 1989. The hillside at Papoose Lake looks the same today as it did in the Greenpeace Group's 1983 account. White alkali flat, low ridgeline, desert scrub, alkali dust in the still air of a Nevada afternoon. No visible structures, no visible doors, no visible evidence of anything worth building a secret naval program around in one of the most remote and inaccessible corners of the restricted American West. The same hillside Bob Lazar described in 1989, in the same words, with the same physical details, in 2018, in 2026. We know the base was real. We know the programs were real. We know the Navy ran them. We know Congress has been told something it cannot repeat in a public hearing. We know that a former intelligence officer with verifiable credentials named the specific facility in sworn testimony and then declined to elaborate because he could not do so without a secure room that Congress was denied access to. We do not know what was in those hangars. We do not know whether the object Lazar worked on was what he said it was, or something else entirely, or nothing at all. We do not know whether the briefing documents said what he recalls, or whether what they said was true. We do not know whether the element 115 he described is the moscovium that decays in milliseconds, or something that no human laboratory has yet produced, or a piece of fiction built from 1980s nuclear physics speculation. The desert holds its position. The hillside looks like nothing. The studio, where a shadowed face said extraordinary things in 1989, has broadcast 37 more years of ordinary news since then, and the story has not resolved. And the phones that rang off the hook that Tuesday evening are long silent, and the question that came out of those 11 minutes has only gotten stranger and more specific and more uncomfortable with time. Not because more has been proven, because more of the world around the unprovable center has turned out to be real.